It's like magic. While I'm changing out the technical stuff here, I've actually been sitting in the back, listening mostly, and I was thinking about, I don't know, a bunch of random things were coming to mind that I wanted to share with you. So I'm the new director of Jewish Studies on campus, and so I always use any opportunity with a large group of people to share a little bit of the wisdom that I teach my students. There we go. Don't forget that.
I will.
So one, the word for humanities in Hebrew, the way it's referred to at Israeli universities, is the sciences of the spirit, which I thought was very, I don't know, somehow telling, illuminating that it's not about the mind actually, it's about spirit, and the word spirit in Hebrew also means the breath. So there's something very embodied about this notion of the humanities in Hebrew. And the other little anecdote was a story trying to explain why we all have this little cleft in the place above our lip. Rabbis are obsessed with explaining every phenomenon in the world, non-scientifically, precisely non-scientifically. And their explanation is that when a baby is in the womb, I'm multitasking here, when a baby's in the womb, by the woman's bedside is an angel with a candle illuminating the scene. And the angel, right before the kid is born, hits the kid right here, taps the kid right on the face with a hot finger that had been in the flame. And the angel's doing that, and that's why we have this. That is why we have this. Scientists will agree. Because we already know everything there is to know. And the angel, right before a kid is born, hits you here and you forget everything. And it's this notion that actually learning is remembering. That we actually all had this sense of knowledge of self from in utero. And that your entire life is actually about getting back to the place before you started. A little bit of Jewish philosophy. Last story I was going to tell us how I got into this profession, because I have to inspire my students to actually be interested in what we're doing. And I remember sitting in my organic chemistry class in my first year of school at Berkeley when I was 18 years old. And I sat there going, why the hell am I in here? This has no meaning. I don't think this is going to have any spiritual import in the world. And I dropped the chemical engineering major that day and switched to history. And that brings me to be a historian today. And I try to foster that moment, not to say that chemical engineers shouldn't be chemical engineers, but I want them to find meaning in being a chemical engineer. Let's put it that way. So I have two things that I wanted to share with you. And I may not have understood the charge of what we were supposed to do here, but I'm a little bit more of a practical person. So I'm interested in what it means to practice the future of the arts and humanities. What does it look like? And so I wanted to present a little piece of my own research about what I think that might look like, and then a new form of learning that I've been trying out that is at least transformative for me, and I'm hoping for my students as well. So the first thing I wanted to present to you is some photographs that I'm working on this book on Soviet Jewish photographers who photographed World War II and the Holocaust. And I'm presenting this material to you to think about what is the power of the arts and humanities to have, both for the individual but also in the world. In the world. In, since we were talking about in versus of. So I'm writing this chapter right now on liberation photography. And whenever I'm in a group, in a room like this of Americans, I'm going to present to you liberation photography. Those of you who know, maybe you remember it, what year would liberation photography come from? So I'm in such a room. What year does liberation photography come from World War II, to be fair? What year?
Students would know this.
Depends what country you're asking.
Aha, depends what country you're asking. So for, say, France, it might be 44. But we're in America, and literally, the first answer is always April 1945. Someone in the audience says, I still remember seeing those pictures. I'll get back to that picture. So, this photograph ring a bell for people? I use this photograph to show a sort of canonical image of liberation. I also make it a habit of my own personal ethics. I don't tend to show pictures of dead people unless there's a particular reason to. So when I show liberation photography, I try to show ones of survivors. And this one happens to have Elie Wiesel in it. So this is April 1945. So the research I'm doing is from the Soviet Union. So it's a completely different story about World War II and the Holocaust. And when I was in residence at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, this was the photograph that they have opening the permanent exhibition. If any of you have ever been to DC, you take an elevator up to the top floor and you start and you work your way down. And this photograph is what greets you. Horrifying photograph from April 1945. And it sets the context that we are in a story about America. This is a story about how America relates to the Holocaust. So I went there. They asked me to, can you come and be a fellow here? What would it look like if we did this from a Soviet perspective? So the picture that I gave them is the bottom right. The bottom right, it is what I call the first liberation photograph. It's from January 1942. It's taken in southern Russia, and it's from a city that was occupied by Nazi Germany for 6 weeks. They mass murdered all the Jews in the whole town, in a burial, buried them all out near the outskirts of town, and then the Soviet Union reconquered the city. And so I showed this picture to the curator of the Holocaust Museum, and I said, this is your first liberation photograph, not April 1945. So we had this long conversation about the power of this kind of research to transform how we understand things that seem so natural and obvious to us. And now their exhibitions start to include other narratives. It had been a very American narrative. It is, after all, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. But they're complicating the way they tell their story in the museums, and for me, as a humanities scholar, and as someone who uses the visual to tell stories, it was very important for me to have my work have that kind of transformative effect. It's one of those moments where you're like, wow, our research actually has profound effect in the world if it's getting out in the world that way. So the second thing I wanted to show you, and Chris and I did not plan this, but I'm going to show you my version of humanities scholars doing what they do. So these are photographs. These are photographs taken about 1 month ago when I was the historian in residence on basically a travel course to medieval Spain, where we were studying Jewish history in medieval Spain. Anyone recognize where this is? Anyone been to Spain recently? This is the Alhambra in Granada. This is the Alhambra. This is a main tourist site in the middle of the Alhambra, right in the middle of the gardens. It's 4 p.m. There's tourists swarming around us. And this is our Rubens. This is our version of the Rubens, taken by a less talented artist, but nonetheless capturing what, in my mind, is the way humanities is going forward. So what are we doing here? We are in the Alhambra, which was a great center of Jewish learning in the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century, and we are studying the poetry of an Arabic Jewish medieval poet who wrote in Hebrew and Arabic on the grounds of the Alhambra, where he had been the military leader of the Granada army against the Christians. And the kids are actually studying poetry here in that place where he potentially even wrote it, on these very grounds. So I'm calling this, I'm playing with names, if people have better names, I'm calling this in situ learning. So scientists, botanists, people who work in ecology, they can go up in the mountains and actually be out in their areas of study. And I think for too long, humanities has thought that our primary place to go is the salon, indoors, with a nice painting behind us, or into the library. And I actually asked, what would it look like if we brought the humanities to the place where the humanistic and the arts were actually created? And so we designed this tour where we were studying all of the texts in the places where the texts either were, or it's pretty hard to know exactly where, but at least in the areas where the people who created these texts were. And we found the experience, and I say we because the students have all, that's what this film is, the students giving their nice testimonials so people want to do this next travel trip. Transformative, absolutely transformative. And when you ask them, it's this very inchoate, inexplicable, I don't really know why, but somehow, sitting in a room these guys are all from Chicago, sitting in a room at the University of Chicago studying this poetry, has absolutely no effect on me in comparison to sitting here in the middle of the Alhambra, where this stuff would have been written. And I haven't yet theorized what place has to do with the humanities, like the role that place plays, working on that. But the outcome is there. Like, I'm actually right now just interested in the practice, and so I'm actually starting to generate these kinds of courses where we take our students to places where these humanities and arts were created and have them studying primary texts, not around a table in a salon, but literally on the floor on a marble mosaic. And for me, this notion of transformation, which is, frankly, it's a banal word that we all use over and over again, except when you see it. And when you see it happening, you know it. It's, again, untheorizable, inexplicable science of the soul that you see when you have a bunch of kids studying medieval poetry out in the middle of Spain. And so for me, the future of the arts and humanities is about thinking about how it makes meaning in people's lives, and also thinking about how it affects the way we all think about narrative, history, story, and self. And I think these guys got a lot out of that. And I'm happy to tell you more about how to organize such a